Ever wondered how oxytocin, the love hormone, influences the way we connect with our dogs? Or why new parents experience a shift in attachment styles toward their pets? Dr Jessica Oliva is here to unpack these insights and so much more. Professionally Psyched is the podcast that brings you cutting-edge psychology research and real-world insights from our Psych community of clinicians, researchers, and educators alike. We're here to explore how psychology shapes our everyday lives and impacts the world around us. Hi everyone, and welcome to Professionally Psyched. I'm Jessica Muller, PhD candidate in Public Health at James Cook University, and before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the land on which we record, and for me today that's the Bindal and Wulgurukaba peoples. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and cultures from wherever you may be tuning in from across the country. Today we join our host Paul Marshall as he dives into the fascinating world of animal-human connections with Senior Lecturer at James Cook University, Dr Jessica Oliva. So whether you're a devoted dog parent, an animal enthusiast, or just simply curious about the psychology of companionship, this episode has something for you. So grab your headphones and get ready to get professionally psyched about the deep ties we have with our furry friends. Enjoy.
Well, hello, Jessica Oliva. It's a real pleasure to be speaking with you today on Professionally Psyched.
You too, thanks for having me.
Maybe we could start by you sharing a little bit about who you are and how you got to be here with us today.
Absolutely. Well, I come from a background in behavioural neuroscience, so I kind of majored in psychology and neuroscience. And I always knew that I wanted to do research from basically my first year studying. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do though. And I think that's part of the joy of being an undergraduate student is, you know, the world's your oyster, so to speak, when you're sort of taking in all this different knowledge. So I went through, did my undergraduate, did my honours year, and then when it came to doing a PhD, I chose to do a PhD and take that research path. I started a PhD actually looking at left brain, right brain laterality and what's called the nasal cycle. And that basically just refers to the patency of your nostrils being more open than the other throughout the course of the day, and it's sort of cycling every 20 minutes. And it's supposed to correlate between the activation of your different hemispheres. So when your right nostril's open, your left hemisphere is more active and vice versa. For various reasons, that PhD, I chose to jump ship about 1 year in. And about the same time that I was thinking about what I was going to do, I adopted a dog from the Lost Dogs Home in Melbourne called Bonnie. And being a very inexperienced dog owner, I decided to buy a book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home. And it was a really cool account of this sixth sense that dogs have to know when their owners are coming home, but also in general, the sixth sense that animals have in order to be able to predict things that are going to happen in the future, like maybe something bad happening to their owner getting sick or dying, predicting natural disasters, all these sorts of things. And I thought, wow, this is really cool research. Like, I wonder if this is happening at my university. I was studying at Monash at the time. And I found a group called the Anthozoological Research Group that I had no idea existed throughout my whole time studying at Monash. I'd never heard of this group. And I'd also never heard of any research on human-animal interactions. And I thought, wow, like where's this lab sort of been hiding all this time? And why haven't we learnt this about this as undergrads? So anyway, that started, I ended up changing my supervisory panel and my project, and I embarked on this new PhD looking at oxytocin and the role of oxytocin in human-dog bonding and the ability of domestic dogs to use human social cues for communicative purposes.
Wow. So I take it then that it's a fair assumption that you're a dog person and not a cat person then?
Look, yes, I am a dog person. I'm an animal lover, broadly speaking, but my favorite animal would definitely have to be dogs. And dogs are the only animal that I've ever owned. And I really owe that whole trajectory to my little dog, Bonnie. I think that I was so surprised by how much I fell in love with her so quickly that I wanted to somehow quantify it in scientific terms. And hence why I decided to look at oxytocin being the love hormone, or the cuddle hormone. I now know that love for her transcends anything that I can possibly measure in scientific terms. But it definitely set me on this amazing trajectory and career path that I feel very, very grateful for.
I was reading a little bit of your research, and I think everyone would agree that our relationships to our pets can change as we go through our lives. But
Yeah.
you were looking at a point there on how Australian women's relationships with their dogs change when a human baby takes the place of their fur baby.
Yes, absolutely. It's sort of the age-old tale of, Lady and the Tramp, basically. The new human baby comes in and the dog moves out, and it really, I think, is linked to attachment style and attachment relationship, and that's been one of the focuses since my PhD of my research, is looking at attachment and relationships to our pets. And I think that attachments sort of exist in a hierarchy, and that hierarchy can change, and those roles that people and pets play in our lives can also change over time. So we might have the dog high up in that hierarchy before having a baby, and then baby comes along and everything gets shifted. The role of the dog, the attachment to the dog, perhaps the style of attachment as well. And so, yeah, what we did find was that in that period of the first couple of years after having a baby, and I'm obviously talking aggregate results here, but there seems to be a shift to a more avoidance style of attachment towards the family dog. And in some ways it makes sense because, and I know this firsthand, I've had a baby this year, you are very time poor. There's a whole lot more stress in the family home in many different ways. And depending on the behavior and the trust you have with your dog, different rules might have to be implemented in the house. And sometimes it's easier for the dog to, no longer be allowed in certain spaces and on the furniture or that sort of thing. So the dog might become a bit more like a chore to look after than, say, a joy that it once was. The literature suggests that, and there's not a lot of literature out there on this topic, but that may change over time again. So when the baby or the human child is no longer demanding so much of your time and energy, the dog comes sort of back into frame a bit more and, becomes that someone that you can shower with love and care, particularly, as the children get older and more independent and no longer in need of that.
What I found interesting, and it's a theme I think that runs through your research, is kind of the gender differences. Because when I was talking to my wife about that particular research, she immediately said, "Oh, yes, of course." That change from when you have a fur baby to a human baby, and she described feeling guilty because of
Yeah.
the change in the way that she treated it.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense. It makes sense. And I think, not to take anything away from dads, but particularly within that first year to 2 years, mums tend to bear the brunt of the effort in terms of caring for the baby, particularly, because of what their bodies are going through and the hormonal changes that are occurring and all of that. So it makes sense that there would be a shift in the relationship. And there's a shift in the relationship between partners and between other family members as well. We know this, that's very well documented. And so there's no reason why there wouldn't also be a shift in our relationship with our pets. It's just that nobody's really looked at it scientifically anyway.
And that's not, I suppose, the only place that gender differences have appeared in your work, because you've done some work with the animal empathy scale and looked at gender differences in levels of empathy. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
I ran a study recently looking at Australian men and their empathy towards animals and how that might be influenced by the interactions with animals that they have. So the study didn't directly compare males and females, but we know it's very well established in the literature that women have higher levels of empathy towards both humans and animals. And women also tend to be more likely to respond to surveys looking at relationships with animals. So we know a lot more about women's relationships with animals or women's attitudes towards animals than men. Some men are probably less represented in the literature. And so we really wanted to look at or conduct a study that was looking only at men and how empathy in men might be influenced by the interactions or the experiences that they have with animals. And so we wanted to compare men that had owned animals, men that were in the agricultural industry in some way, so in most cases farmers, men that had never had or had very limited experiences with animals, so had never owned an animal and had never worked in the agricultural industry either. And we found that the empathy levels were highest in the men who were pet owners compared to the other two groups.
So what's the relevance, or how do we apply that finding in the real world then?
Look, it's a really good question. I guess the takeaway from it is that in order to increase empathy, we need to have interactions with, the subjects for whom we want to have that empathy for. So, the promotion of human-animal interactions is, I guess, an obvious takeaway here. But obviously it needs to be in a manner such that the welfare of the animal is also considered. I'm always cautious of sort of promoting pet ownership as something that everybody should do, because I don't believe that everybody should do it. I believe that people should make a very considered decision to own a pet with the commitment to care for the animal and to also do everything you can to increase its welfare over the course of its lifetime.
And I think that was one of the things that I found surprising, was that having a pet when you're young doesn't necessarily increase the levels of empathy, but I think it was that responsibility or the commitment for the care that you get as an adult that was really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like this finding because it's something that I can relate to as well. And other people might also be able to relate to this same idea that, when your pet is sick, for example, my pet Bonnie, she passed away several years ago, but she had a congenital heart condition that in her last few years of life required me to really be on top of giving her medication, every 12 hours at the right time and making sure she got the right care that she needed. And I mean, it was stressful, but it was also, I think it was very bonding in a strange way. And there's actually a study out there showing that people that care for dogs that have congenital heart diseases actually makes their bond stronger. And I think it has something to do with making a very selfless sacrifice without this expectation of getting anything back in return. That is perhaps the definition of love. It makes us invested in the relationship and makes that relationship stronger, even though it is more of a burden to care for that animal.
Well, I think that's a lovely segue into something that everybody listening today might be interested in. You've actually developed your own scale. I wonder if you'd share with us a little bit about your pet owner connectedness scale.
Absolutely, would love to. So back in 2020, we conducted a study looking at the loneliness buffering effect of pet ownership during the COVID-19 lockdowns. And anybody who might have spent time in Melbourne, where I was at the time, would understand just how overwhelming and consuming those lockdowns were. We were the most locked down city in the world at one point. And so looking at people that were living alone, with or without a dog or a cat, and seeing what impact that pet ownership had on their levels of loneliness. So what we found from that study was that dog owners were significantly less lonely than people that didn't own a dog. So that included cat owners and people with neither pet. But interestingly, looking through the literature on this pet effect on loneliness, what came up time and time again was that there doesn't really exist a scale that accurately measures what the pet is doing to that loneliness. It's more based on all these scales that we were using are more based on human relationships and loneliness in that context. There was no scale that sort of looked at loneliness in the context of pet ownership per se. And so there was a gap there. But instead of looking at loneliness, I decided to look at, well, what are the pets actually providing? What is the inverse of loneliness? And for us, that was connectedness. And because this study was a mixed method study, we had quantitative numbered data, but also a really rich database of qualitative data where people have provided answers to our question of how did being a pet owner influence your experience of the lockdowns. And so we decided to use that rich qualitative data to build our scale, looking at, what does it mean to be connected to your pet.
You came out of that study with 2 subscales that you then subsequently validated in a second study?
Yes, exactly. That's right. So the first subscale was looking at kind of the emotional connection between pet and owner, or owner towards their pet.
Mm.
And then the second subscale was looking more broadly at how does being a pet owner connect us to something a bit more broad, like to nature or to the present moment or to reality. And we're currently conducting a collaborative study with the RSPCA, looking at how connection to our pet develops over time. So it's a longitudinal study looking at different time points, 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year, and looking at how those 2 different types of connection change over time, or hopefully increase over time.
So, Jessica, one of the things that I took away, and I declared my biases early on, is that dog owners are better people than cat owners. Is that true?
No, I wouldn't say better. There are personality differences.
So we're nicer. Is that what you're saying? We're nicer than cat owners?
No, I wouldn't say that either. The only personality factors that I can speak to are the ones that came out of a recent study. So we looked at the big 5 personality
Big
factors.
favourite of all undergraduate psychologists, yep.
Absolutely. And we also added in an extra one of resilience. And the reason we did that was because the study that I was speaking to earlier that we conducted during the lockdowns showed that dog owners were less lonely than people that didn't own a dog. And we originally surmised that the dog was acting as some kind of social catalyst, encouraging their owner out of the house to go for walks and meeting other people doing the same thing. So then we did a follow-up study looking at dog walking and loneliness. And we expected to find that, the more you walk your dog, the more often you walk your dog, the less lonely you are. But we couldn't find any connection between dog walking and loneliness. And we also couldn't find any relationship between frequency of dog interactions and loneliness. So it was sort of showing us that the dog really didn't have anything to do with their owners being less lonely. So then we started to think, well, maybe there's something inherent within the owners themselves that make them more resilient to social stress. So maybe more resilient people like to own dogs more than less resilient people. That was the hypothesis that we were testing, adding in this resilience factor. We wanted to look at the big 5 personality factors, and this has been looked at several times in cat owners versus dog owners, or cat people versus dog people. And there's been slightly different findings depending on which study you look at and how you separate your groups. But cat owners or cat people have come out as more neurotic, pretty robustly in the literature. So we were expecting to find that, and that's exactly what we found. We found that cat owners were more neurotic and dog owners were more resilient. And they were the only 2 differences among all of those personality factors that we found. So certainly not, I wouldn't say better or worse or anything like that. And I think it's really important as well to remember that personality factors exist on a sliding scale. They're certainly not categorizing all cat people as, neurotic and all dog owners as resilient, but perhaps slightly more or slightly less on a sliding scale looking at group data.
So where to next for you?
For me, I think, in a changing world where our relationship with animals and just the way that we conduct ourselves and live our lives impacts on animals, thinking things like, climate change, I would like to look more at environmental psychology topics, particularly in relation to conservation and conservation of animal species in particular. I think that we have a social responsibility to look after all beings on Earth, including our natural environment. So I would like to broaden maybe from the domestic species into more wildlife species and look at our relationship with animals more broadly.
I think that feels like a nice place to finish our conversation today. So, Dr. Jessica Oliva, thank you very much for joining us on Professionally Psyched here today.
Been my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Professionally Psyched. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the ongoing support of our Psyched community. If you'd like to show your support or if you want us to cover anything on the pod, reach out via our emails, and don't forget you can listen to full episodes on Spotify.